Good morning. Thank you for joining me today. This morning, we'll be in Leviticus chapter 15, verse 1 through chapter 16, verse 28. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, "Speak to the Israelites and tell them, when any man has a discharge from his body, his discharge is unclean. Now this is his uncleanness in regard to his discharge, whether his body secretes his discharge or blocks his discharge, he is unclean. All the days that his body has a discharge or his body blocks his discharge, this is his uncleanness. Any bed the man with a discharge lies on will be unclean, and any furniture he sits on will be unclean. Anyone who touches his bed must wash his clothes, bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. The one who sits on the furniture the man with a discharge sits on must wash his clothes, bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. The one who touches the body of the man with a discharge must wash his clothes, bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. If the man with the discharge spits on a person who is ceremonially clean, that person must wash his clothes, bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. Any means of riding the man with a discharge rides on will be unclean. Anyone who touches anything that was under him will be unclean until evening, and the one who carries those items must wash his clothes, bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. Anyone whom the man with the discharge touches, without having rinsed his hands in water, must wash his clothes, bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. The clay vessel which the man with the discharge touches must be broken, and any wooden utensil must be rinsed in water. When the man with the discharge becomes clean from his discharge, he is to count off for himself 7 days for his purification, and he must wash his clothes, bathe in fresh water, and be clean. And then on the 8th day he is to take for himself 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, and he is to present himself before the Lord at the entrance of the meeting tent, and give them to the priest. And the priest is to make one of them a sin offering and the other a burnt offering. So the priest is to make atonement for him before the Lord for his discharge. When a man has a seminal emission, he must bathe his whole body in water and be unclean until evening. And he must wash in water any clothing or leather that has semen on it, and it will be unclean until evening. When a man has sexual intercourse with a woman and there is a seminal emission, they must bathe in water and be unclean until evening. When a woman has a discharge and her discharge is blood from her body, she is to be in her menstruation 7 days, and anyone who touches her will be unclean until evening. Anything she lies on during her menstruation will be unclean, and anything she sits on will be unclean. Anyone who touches her bed must wash his clothes, bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. Anyone who touches any furniture she sits on must wash his clothes, bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. If there is something on the bed or on the furniture she sits on, when he touches it, he will be unclean until evening. And if a man actually has sexual intercourse with her so that her menstrual impurity touches him, then he will be unclean 7 days, and any bed he lies on will be unclean. When a woman's discharge of blood flows many days, not at the time of her menstruation, or it flows beyond the time of her menstruation, all the days of her discharge of impurity will be like the days of her menstruation. She is unclean. Any bed she lies on, all the days of her discharge will be to her like the bed of her menstruation. Any furniture she sits on will be unclean, like this impurity of her menstruation. And anyone who touches them will be unclean, and he must wash his clothes, bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. If she becomes clean from her discharge, then she is to count off for herself 7 days, and afterward she will be clean. Then on the 8th day she must take for herself 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, and she must bring them to the priest at the entrance of the meeting tent. And the priest is to make one a sin offering and the other a burnt offering. So the priest is to make atonement for her before the Lord from her discharge of impurity. Thus you are to set the Israelites apart from their impurity, so that they do not die in their impurity by defiling my tabernacle which is in their midst. This is the law of the one with a discharge, the one who has a seminal emission and becomes unclean by it, the one who is sick in her menstruation, the one with a discharge, whether male or female, and a man who has sexual intercourse with an unclean woman. The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of Aaron's 2 sons, when they approached the presence of the Lord and died. And the Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron your brother that he must not enter at any time into the holy place inside the veil canopy in front of the atonement plate that is on the ark, so that he may not die. For I will appear in the cloud over the atonement plate." In this way, Aaron is to enter into the sanctuary with a young bull for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He must put on a holy linen tunic. Linen leggings are to cover his body, and he is to wrap himself with a linen sash and wrap his head with a linen turban. They are holy garments, so he must bathe his body in water and put them on. He must also take 2 male goats from the congregation of the Israelites for a sin offering, and 1 ram for a burnt offering. Then Aaron is to present the sin offering bull, which is for himself, and is to make atonement on behalf of himself and his household. He must take the 2 goats and stand them before the Lord at the entrance of the meeting tent, and Aaron is to cast lots over the 2 goats, 1 lot for the Lord and 1 lot for Azazel. Aaron must then present the goat which has been designated by lot for the Lord, and he is to make it a sin offering. But the goat which has been designated by lot for Azazel is to be stood alive before the Lord to make atonement on it by sending it away to Azazel into the wilderness. Aaron is to present the sin offering bull, which is for himself, and he is to make atonement on behalf of himself and his household. He is to slaughter the sin offering bull, which is for himself, and take a censer full of coals of fire from the altar before the Lord, and a full double handful of finely ground fragrant incense, and bring them inside the veil canopy. He must then put the incense on the fire before the Lord, and the cloud of incense will cover the atonement plate, which is above the ark of the testimony, so that he will not die. Then he is to take some of the blood of the bull, and sprinkle it with his finger on the eastern face of the atonement plate, and in front of the atonement plate he is to sprinkle some of the blood 7 times with his finger. He must then slaughter the sin offering goat, which is for the people. He is to bring its blood inside the veil canopy, and he is to do with its blood just as he did to the blood of the bull. He is to sprinkle it on the atonement plate and in front of the atonement plate. So he is to make atonement for the holy place from the impurities of the Israelites and from their transgressions, and with regards to all their sins. And thus he is to do for the meeting tent which resides with them in the midst of their impurities. Nobody is to be in the meeting tent when he enters to make atonement in the holy place until he goes out, and he has made atonement on his behalf, on behalf of his household, and on behalf of the whole assembly of Israel. Then he is to go out to the altar which is before the Lord and make atonement for it. He is to take some of the blood of the bull and some of the blood of the goat and put it all around on the horns of the altar. Then he is to sprinkle on it some of the blood with his finger 7 times, and cleanse and consecrate it from the impurities of the Israelites. When he has finished purifying the holy place, the meeting tent, and the altar, he is to present the live goat. Aaron is to lay his 2 hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of the Israelites and all their transgressions in regard to all their sins, and thus he is to put them on the head of the goat and send it away into the wilderness by the hand of a man standing ready. The goat is to bear on itself all their iniquities into an inaccessible land, so he is to send the goat away in the wilderness. Aaron must then enter the meeting tent and take off the linen garments which he had put on when he entered the sanctuary and leave them there. And then he must bathe his body in water in a holy place, put on his clothes, and go out and make his burnt offering and the people's burnt offering. So he is to make atonement on behalf of himself and the people. Then he is to offer up the fat of the sin offering and smoke on the altar. And the one who sent the goat away to Azazel must wash his clothes, bathe his body in water, and afterwards he may re-enter the camp. The bull of the sin offering and the goat of the sin offering, whose blood was brought to make atonement in the holy place, must be brought outside the camp, and their hide, their flesh, and their dung must be burned up. And the one who burns them must wash his clothes and bathe his body in water, and afterward he may re-enter the camp. Thank you. Okay, so we've got cleansing unhealthiness here in the first chapter with, it seems like the same sort of sacrifice is being offered as, well, No, it's slightly different from the offering for infectious skin diseases. You have two young pigeons or turtle doves being offered. One is a sin offering and one for a burnt offering. So, and then you have the Law of Atonement here, and you have, as part of that, the scapegoat concept being introduced, where in 1622, the goat is to bear on itself all their iniquities into an inaccessible land, so he's to send the goat away into the wilderness. From what I know of Jewish custom, it was the custom to push the goat of the scapegoat off a cliff. And I think this was because instead of actually going into the wilderness and staying there, it would come back to its owner. And so, to make sure that it stayed in the wilderness, they would push it off a cliff. Why did the NET not translate Azazel? Because that is the word for scapegoat here. Meaning dubious. Thank you, Strongs. Only mentioned 3 times in Leviticus 16, 8, 10, and 26. Gesenius Hebrew Chaldee Lexicon says, only found in the law of the Day of Atonement, respecting which many conjectures have been made. I have no doubt that it should be rendered averter, from a root, to remove, to separate. Interesting. Well, that's an interesting definition, because if it's an averter, then what is it averting but a judgment or disaster from Israel, I suppose. Carrying on, Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through 23. Now the Pharisees and some of the experts in the law who came from Jerusalem gathered around him, and they saw that some of Jesus' disciples ate their bread with unclean hands, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they perform a ritual washing, holding fast to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. They hold fast to many other traditions, the washing of cups, pots, kettles, and dining couches. The Pharisees and the experts in the law asked him, why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with unwashed hands? He said to them, Isaiah prophesied correctly about you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. They worship me in vain, teaching as doctrine the commandments of men. Having no regard for the command of God, you hold fast to human tradition. He also said to them, you neatly reject the commandment of God in order to set up your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever insults his father or mother must be put to death. But you say that if anyone tells his father or mother, whatever help you would have received from me is Corban, that is, a gift for God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother. Thus you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and you do many things like this. Then he called the crowd again and said to them, listen to me, everyone, and understand. There is nothing outside of a person that can defile him by going into him. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles him. Now when Jesus had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about the parable. He said to them, are you so foolish? Don't you understand that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him? For it does not enter his heart, but his stomach, and then goes out into the sewer. This means all foods are clean. He said, "What comes out of a person defiles him, for from within, out of the human heart come evil ideas, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, evil deceit, debauchery, envy, slander, pride, and folly. All these evils come from within and defile the person." Yeah, I think it's important to examine ourselves and um, see if we're um, just honoring God with our lips, but our hearts are really far from Him. Because I think it's easy to do, especially in our culture, but I imagine just as easily in other cultures to put on this veneer of righteousness of Christianity and be respected by men, rather than looking for the respect from God. Yeah, and Jesus summarizes a particularly, well, an instance of the tradition of the elders where what they're teaching is going against the commands of God, where a man could designate something as being a gift for God, and that could even be like the inheritance, that could be like anything that he would help his father or mother with, and thus he didn't have to give it to his father and mother to help them, but yeah, could instead get out through that loophole. Yeah. Well, I think still even retaining use of it, because he could just donate it upon his death, is my understanding anyway. Yeah. Carrying on. Psalm chapter 40, verses 11 through 17. O Lord, you do not withhold your compassion from me. May your loyal love and faithfulness continually protect me. For innumerable dangers surround me. My sins overtake me, so I am unable to see. They outnumber the hairs of my head, so my strength fails me. Please be willing, O Lord, to rescue me. O Lord, hurry and help me. May those who are trying to snatch away my life be totally embarrassed and ashamed. May those who want to harm me be turned back and ashamed. May those who say to me, "Aha, aha," be humiliated and disgraced. May all of those who seek you be happy and rejoice in you. May those who love to experience your deliverance say continually, "May the Lord be praised." I am oppressed and needy. May the Lord pay attention to me. You are my helper and my deliverer. Oh my God, do not delay. And finally, Proverbs 10, verses 13 and 14. Wisdom is found in the words of the discerning person, but the one who lacks wisdom will be disciplined. Those who are wise store up knowledge, but foolish speech leads to imminent destruction. Yep. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining me today. Hope you have a great day.